Iran was on the verge of bankruptcy. The country was faced with a threat of revolution. Iran had become the weakest link in the West's defensive chain against Russia. It was at this moment that the United States urged the Shah to start his own revolution. First of all, he created the Development Corps, an army of graduates conscripted to combat illiteracy, disease, and ignorance amongst Iran's peasant population. Here, this elite corps is undergoing training. The Shah feels that this type of army should serve as a model for the rest of the world. After all, revolutions can start from the top. Long live our Shah and Shah. Long live our country for all eternity. The Pahlavis have raised our country to greater heights than ever before. The Iranians have always been blessed with good fortune because God has always been their protector. Glory to our country and to our emperor. Ariema, hurrah, hurrah, hurrah. To achieve what he had set out to do, the Shah has attempted to rally the people around him. Every morning, a special prayer for the Shah has to be said in every school in the country. The history of the royal family is taught even the most isolated nomad camp. Here too, the children learn the great deeds of the Pahlavi dynasty. Great Shah, your love fills all our hearts. Almighty God is your protector. I swear by our ancient empire and by our long and noble history that as long as I live, my motto will ever be, God, my emperor, and my country. Your strength, the strength of God, has saved our country. O Emperor, what tribulations you must have endured to create this, our new Iran. Long live the Shah, long live the Shah. The youth section of the Iran Novin, or New Iran Party, acclaimed their emperor. The party was created by the Shah himself, who intends it to be the country's sole political party under the title of the National Revival Party. The white flags symbolize the White Revolution, the name given by the Shah to his revolution. Iran's constitution provides for a parliamentary form of government, but the Prime Minister is responsible solely to the Shah. All the power is, however, in the hands of the Shah, and it was he who defined the aim of the White Revolution, which was to get Iran admitted as a member of the Wealthy Nations Club. Admittedly, much has changed over the past 10 years. The population of Tehran, the capital, has grown from 1 million to 3 million. The city is bursting at every seam in a giddy climate of speculation, with banks and supermarkets springing up on every corner, and with streets packed with automobiles. The watchword of the White Revolution is certainly not austerity. Conspicuous consumption has become the driving force behind development. Iran seems to have no qualms about becoming a consumer society. To cope with this demand, factories are being built everywhere in an effort to reduce Iran's dependence on imported products. In the space of 10 years, industrial production has quadrupled, and it is estimated that it will double over the next 10 years. However, the recent pace of investment is rapidly outstripping even these estimates. Over the past 10 years, 22,000 miles of highway have been constructed. Not only do these highways link the main centers of consumption with the areas of production, but also, and primarily, with the ports, because Iran is becoming increasingly part of the world economy. Bandar Abbas, a poor fishing village little more than 15 years ago, is fast becoming one of the largest ports in the Middle East. But progress also means destroying the existing scenery. The old must make way for the new. Only the royal cities, such as Esfahan and Persepolis, have been spared as evidence for the tourists of the might of Persia's ancient dynasties. Yezd is not on the tourist circuit of royal cities. The old parts of the town are being ripped out by bulldozers and replaced by wide, modern avenues. The armed forces and the police are the two main bulwarks of power. Over the past 10 years, they have each made spectacular progress in terms of both numbers and expenditure. The army alone absorbs about 30% of the total national budget. $3 billion of military equipment purchased in 1974. On order in 1975, 80 F-4 Phantoms, 3 dozen fighter bombers, 10 of the Galaxy giant aircraft, and 700 helicopters complete with 500 instructors. The Shah has already succeeded in making Iran the #1 military power in the Middle East. And all this thanks to oil. The country's oil revenues, which in 1972 amounted to $3 billion, had risen to over $20 billion in 1974. Will this fantastic increase in oil revenues enable the Shah to achieve his objective? And for the people of Iran, what is the true picture behind these figures? The cornerstone of the Imperial Revolution was land reform. However, the land was not given to the peasants. They had to purchase it on installments. What looks here like a dotted line across the desert are the visible sections of a kanat, an underground irrigation channel invented by the Persians some 3,000 years ago. Without irrigation, farming on the high plateau would be impossible. It takes 10 men, 5 working underground and 5 on the surface, about 2 years to construct a kanat. It is an expensive operation. Each peasant was allotted between 5 and 15 acres of land, but land which had been starved of fertilizer for a long time, without agricultural equipment, and with kanats full of sand or caved in. Faced with the threat of losing their land, the owners had ceased making any investment. So to start with, the peasants had to borrow money to repair the kanats, buy seed, and pay the annual installment on the compensation received by the landowner. As for the landowner, he received this compensation as a lump sum, provided he invested this in industry. This was how these large landowners became industrialists, and even richer than before. Many peasants, through lack of funds, were forced to abandon their land. 6 years after the start of the land reform, 1/3 of the rural population had migrated to the shanty towns. In some of the more prosperous regions, the peasants were able to make a go of it, like here at Husainabad, not far from Shiraz. The inhabitants were allocated between 10 and 15 acres of well-irrigated land, but whatever meager loans they received were too often used to buy transistor radios, motorcycles, or household appliances. Now they're well off. They've got everything. They've even got gas, says our interpreter.
Il est propriétaire maintenant?
The young girls in the development corps are here, taking a hand in everything, advisors as well as teachers. Their proudest achievement, based on their advice, was the construction of a mosque.
Avec de l'irrigation? Avec l'eau?
Husainabad had not progressed beyond phase 1 of the land reform, which the government reckoned had, in most cases, been a failure. So a second phase was decided upon, the formation of peasant cooperatives. Khali Kazi was quoted as a typical example of this phase. 400 peasants who have been allotted 2,000 acres of land and 7 officials sent by the government to supervise these peasants, who have to provide them with housing and pay half of their salary. which adds an additional $13,500 to the cooperative's operating expenses, a figure which is out of all proportion to the revenue that can be earned from 2,000 acres, which have to support more than 3,000 people. Here, personal incomes have declined since land reform. This type of cooperative has proved a failure. This much is admitted by the Ministry of Agriculture in Tehran. But for the government, they have one advantage. They are an effective means for supervising the population. The same typical conception of progress seems to underlie all the social planning at Harli Kazi, the concept of the bureaucrats in Tehran, who in obedience to guidelines drawn up by the highest authority, can only conceive of progress in Western terms. It also involves a certain conception of this new society. In every town and village, the children have to march in single file when they leave their school, even in the middle of the desert. Ariamer, a village built at the request of the Empress a few miles from Persepolis, presented as the third and final stage of the land reform. The peasants were obliged to pool their land and form a company in which they are both shareholders and employees. Here there are no less than 22 supervisors. Twice a week, consultations are held in the dispensary. Women no longer weave carpets at home. They are manufactured in a workshop under technical supervision. Like the men on the land, the women have become employees too. The children in the kindergarten are just a little too well behaved, and their sweaters just a little too new. As though this was all staged for the benefit of the tourists, who are regularly shown over the village, but who are not told that the money comes from growing opium. At the end of the day, the performance is over, and the village empties of its inhabitants. Only the officials live in its modern houses. The peasants return to their own village, Kamsabad, a mile and a half away. Another thing which everyone forgets to mention is that the land reform has only affected a 20th of Iran's 50,000 villages. What kind of revolution is this, which only involves a fraction of the population? What about all those peasants who are still, as before, under the control of the landowners? What about all those who cling to the land despite their poverty rather than join the ranks of the unemployed in the town? And all those who no longer have anything to their name? Not even a mule to pull their wooden plough. If the results of the land reform are negative from a social point of view, they're even more so in economic terms. The amount of land under cultivation has not increased, and agricultural production is at a standstill. The cost in human terms has been high, and the country has got no benefit from it. Iran, once practically self-sufficient in agricultural products, now has to import an increasing proportion of its foodstuffs. Trade obviously creates employment, but a country's prosperity can no more be judged by the activity of its ports than by the immensity of its capital city or the richness of its window displays. A constant stream of trucks transport the imported grain to Tehran. These women spend their day picking up the few grains of wheat or rice which fall by the wayside. Even the animals come to see what they can glean along the highway. In 1974, Iran imported 2.5 million tons of wheat, 400,000 tons of sugar, 300,000 tons of rice, and 2 million sheep. This trend is rapidly worsening, and to reverse it would be extremely difficult. Yet another contradiction. Whereas the peasant farmers are joining the ranks of the unemployed in the cities, because of a shortage of truck drivers, not only is the country obliged to hire its goods vehicles from foreign companies, but also the drivers to go with them. "15 years ago, there were 2 million nomads who would migrate across the country every year in their search for grazing for their immense herds. The whole of southern Iran would be covered with tents. Although they led a Spartan existence, these nomads were rich on account of their livestock. These tribes, however, challenged the absolute authority of the Shah. Constantly armed and obeying only their chiefs, they were a dangerous threat to the regime. The Shah's father had already taken measures, sometimes very repressive, to bring these chiefs under control. His declared intent was to settle these tribes, all in the name of progress. His son followed the same policy. The army and the police built barriers across the routes followed by the migratory herds. In 1963, with starvation staring them in the face, the Kashgai tribesmen revolted. The Shah's air force had to be brought in to quell the uprising. By confining these tribesmen to regions where they can no longer maintain their vast herds, and by restricting migration, the regime has robbed these tribesmen of the source of their wealth, which is also a source of wealth for the country. It would seem that the long struggle against the tribes, which began 50 years ago, has been won by the Shah. The nomads have been disarmed and impoverished, and their chiefs are either dead, in exile, or in prison. And their children are being carefully indoctrinated by the schools. Quelling the tribes was also essential for the peaceful prospection for oil, since the country's largest oil reserves are in fact located in these tribal lands. The tribesmen, however, would have preferred to have water rather than oil. Here at least they've been given permission to water their sheep at the Riggs Reservoir. All the young men have left this camp. The old men drive the women away to prevent them talking to strangers. Any petition or request, if it came to the ears of the authorities, would incur reprisals, and not much is needed for a tribesman to find himself in prison. We know of some who are there simply because they criticize the Shah. They won't get out until they have made a written apology, but these people have their pride. Some of them, even after 10 years in prison, still refuse this humiliation. In the meantime, their family survives by selling carpets. The prisons in Iran are full, and not just with students. In the oldest of them, the cells, originally designed to hold 4 prisoners, sometimes contain as many as 12. This is why they're being replaced by new prisons like this one near Esfahan. Its future capacity can be judged by the size of these buildings, which are intended to house the guards and the prison administration. Those tribesmen who are not dead or in prison are reduced to waiting, shovel in hand, for an employer who will hire them for the day. Despite what is said or not said, Iran does have its strikes and demonstrations, although both are strictly forbidden. What is more, every public festival, and in particular the religious festivals, can become an excuse for a demonstration. Although opposition to the Shah's regime has been muzzled, it is still very much alive. Iran's bazaar are not just picturesque markets. Until recently, they formed the backbone of Iran's economy. They were its centers for business, credit and trade, as well as local craft industries, of which there are an astonishing number in this country. The bazaars represented predominantly the small middle class and conservative element in society, and as such were treated with contempt by the country's leaders, who identified progress with westernization. When the new economic reforms robbed the bazaars of their former status, they became the centers of opposition to the regime. Here there are no portraits of the Shah. Another reason for this opposition is the influence of the mullahs or priests amongst the middle classes, who are generally very devout. In the madrasas, the Quranic theological colleges, the mullahs are no longer safe from interference by the political authorities. They have been considered as a dangerous element ever since their most influential Shiite leaders violently criticized the failure of the White Revolution and what they considered to be the regime's abdication of authority in the face of pressure from America. In 1963, troops had to be used to put down the revolt in the holy city of Qum, which followed the exiling of the church's leading dignitaries. It is now known that in one day alone there were 15,000 victims. The mullah's influence is increased by the fact that a Shiite mosque is not only a place of prayer, but also the place where people come to meet and discuss. The Quranic schools, as well as the holy shrines, are now controlled by the Savak, or secret police. The government is intent on training a new generation of mullahs under the control of the Savak. The Shah also uses the Shiite religion as a political weapon by playing on the difference between it and Arab Islam, essentially Sunni. He is fearful of the spread of Islamic socialism, which has toppled so many crowned heads. He never misses an opportunity to remind his audience that the Arab nation only represents 1/6 of the world's Muslim population. And to this he adds a racial note by insisting on the fact that the people of Iran come from Aryan stock, unlike the Semitic Arabs. The city of Yezd is the center of the ancient Iranian religion, whose prophet, Zarathustra, was indeed an Aryan. The Zoroastrians, for a long time an object of scorn, are now regaining influence. We asked the high priest to explain the basis of his religion.
The principle of Zarathustra religion is first believing in one God, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. Zarathustra is the first Aryan prophet who taught monotheism to the Aryan people and all the world. Not converting others according to our community, it is not only the political one, but a racial one, because we want to keep our blood pure and not to be mixed with non-Aryan blood.
This also counts for the Arabs. You would not convert an Arab Muslim, for instance?
No, we don't convert, and we are not allowed to convert also. Both. We don't convert because, you see, there will become the mixture of blood.
But do you think Zarathustra was only a prophet for the Aryans?
No, he was the prophet for all the world. But we think that since Aryan civilization is higher than those of Arabs and others, now if we marry with them, it is as if they graft what we call jungle wood or a jungle tree to a civilized tree, to a nice tree. So the fruit of that grafting will not be as good as that natural tree.
So you believe in the purity of the Aryan race?
And you see also the civilization. If we marry with those who are less civilized than us and who are lower than us as regards civilization and literacy, naturally the next generation will be lower.
Recently, the Shah added the phrase, "Light of the Aryans," to his already long list of titles. When the British troops were withdrawn from the Gulf in 1971, Washington and London delegated to Iran the task of policing the area. The United States financed the construction of the Iranian military base at Bandar Abbas and raised no objection to the occupation of the Arab island of Abu Musa by the Shah's Royal Marines. The Shah has assembled one of the largest fleets of hovercraft in the world. In a matter of hours, whole divisions can be ferried across the Gulf. When these Marines landed on the island of Abu Musa and on the neighboring island of Tamb, the Arab world made only verbal protests, despite the fact that Arab leaders had stated that they would oppose with force any occupation of Arab soil by Iran. An unusual concession for journalists, permission to visit the island of Abu Musa, but we were refused permission to talk to the local inhabitants. The only Arabs we saw, from a distance, were fishermen who had come to submit a petition to the Admiral, second in command of the Royal Fleet. When the oil crisis blew up in the Middle East, the Emirate of Bahrain, on the other side of the Gulf, withdrew the facilities which it had previously made available to the American Navy. At the same moment, Iraq extended further facilities to the Russian fleet. Western strategic requirements, therefore, made it imperative that the Shah's fleet of warships be strengthened. The island in the distance is Tamb. Its Arab inhabitants were evacuated to the Emirate of Ras El Hama, to which the island belonged. You all speak German? Yes, nearly all of us. And where did you learn it? In Germany, in the Bundesmarine. And you, where were you? In France. I speak French very well. I went to the Naval College. Iran is a member of the Cento Regional Pact, which comprises 3 non-Arab Muslim states, Iran, Turkey and Pakistan, and 2 Western powers, the United States and Great Britain. Combined Cento maneuvers are generally organized whenever the area is threatened with a crisis, but Iran's actual military commitment is a little further to the south, in the Sultanate of Oman, where armed revolution has broken out. Iran has sent its troops to fight the Marxist-Leninist guerrillas in Dhofar. Mr. Hoveyda, who was Iran's prime minister at the time, was obliged to admit this. 4 years ago we were in Dhofar, and I've been reading in the papers that Iranian troops were engaged in putting down this revolt. As you know, we've made our position clear. The Persian Gulf is a lifeline for Iran, for the region. 6 million barrels of oil leave the Persian Gulf every day. The vast bulk of our consumer and capital goods are shipped via the Persian Gulf. So it really is Iran's lifeline. We cannot allow subversive elements to gain a foothold in this region. This is why, if one of our neighbors in the Persian Gulf asks for our assistance, we comply, as in this case. Moreover, Iran's style of development forces it to assume this dominant role in the Gulf. Since its industry is on the same scale as any major European power, and since its domestic market is restricted, it has no choice but to export. What is not so obvious is whether this export trade benefits Iran or those Western countries which have set up factories within its borders. Because most of these industries, like this electrical appliance factory, operate under foreign license, using intermediate products, sub-assemblies and components which are all imported. They are no more than satellite plants of European, American and Japanese industry. Certainly, Iran's entrepreneurs have become very wealthy men, but the country itself will reap very little benefit until it succeeds in ridding itself of this industrial dependence. For this reason, Iran is attempting to create a steel industry of its own. The first steel mill being the one at Ariamer, which we would have liked to visit in order to penetrate the mystery surrounding it. No one knows what it produces, since the products it should be supplying continue to be imported. We had been given permission to film it, but we were turned back. All we saw of the steel mills was the policeman's sentry box and the inscriptions to the glory of the Shah. There is no secret, however, about the government's policy with regard to consumption. Its symbol is the automobile. Almost all of these automobiles come off assembly lines in Iran, but all the components, like the assembly lines themselves, are imported. To set up a truly national basic industry of this kind requires enormous capital and a lot of time. Will the revenues from oil be enough? These have already been earmarked for speculative economic investment, an over-equipped army and a government administration which grows larger every year. But oil is not an inexhaustible commodity. The reserves are calculated to last for another 30 years, but at the present rate of extraction it is likely that this period may be shorter. This does not, however, seem to shake Mr. Hoveyda's optimism. It seems to us that the rural areas are rapidly losing their population to the towns. Is there not a danger that Iran will become a vast desert with a few major towns? No, this is a deliberate policy. At the moment, 56% of our population live in rural areas. We plan that this figure should drop to 25% within the next 15 years. Our object is to have 25% of our population in the rural areas. Since we intend to modernize and mechanize our agriculture, it will need far less manpower. This is why we are in the process of transferring our factories and setting up industrial towns in country areas, particularly the processing industries. So in fact, it is a deliberate policy. By its nature, Iran is an industrial country, and so its agriculture must be industrial too.
L'agriculture sera une agriculture industrielle aussi.
Big business, for the most part the multinational companies, has taken charge of agricultural development. Theirs is a speculative form of agriculture. Citrus and other fruits, asparagus and artichokes, all destined for sale on the world market. One crop may cover anything up to 40 or 50,000 acres. The state assumes 85% of the study costs, 60% of the cost of leveling the land, and 50% of the remaining capital outlay. It's easy to understand the optimism of Mr. Naragi, one of the entrepreneurs involved and a personal friend of the Shah.
Profit in an earlier stage, and I don't look for that. I may make some very modest profit, but the greatest gain that I feel I will make is the benefit that in large will be given to the country and to the method of the farming as a whole.
In the meantime, Mr. Naragi owns a flock of 15,000 sheep. The German agricultural expert from the neighboring agro-industrial undertaking, which is under the management of the Shell Oil Company, confirms the fact that the peasant will have no place in the agriculture of the future.
Also meine Firma hat hier den Auftrag übernommen.
My company undertook to develop between 40 and 45,000 acres of land in Khuzestan. Previously, this land was farmed by small landowners, but there's no profit in that these days, that's for sure. And we are here now to give the land a new look. We are leveling, irrigating and farming on a large scale.
Wir levelieren das Land und bewässern und machen natürlich die Landwirtschaft in Großanbau.
On the plain, there are still small farmers living in 100-odd villages, but their turn will soon come because their way of farming is no longer profitable. Even with bulldozers, it takes some time to demolish 100 villages. In the meantime, barbed wire fences separate the peasants from the land which was once theirs. This village will be demolished in a couple of weeks. These new houses, built a short distance away, will house those peasants who will be kept on to work on the estate. These houses were not given to the peasants in compensation for the destruction of their village. They have to pay for them out of the money they received when they were forced to sell their land. This peasant owned 37 acres. And how much did he get for it? For everything, my buildings and the land, I got $350, and they took $200 for the house. And how much does he earn now? 40 cents. And how large is his family? 10.
Und ist zufrieden jetzt oder war zufriedener früher?
These women, who still wear jewelry bought when the family was better off, are obliged to bake their own bread like the poorest peasant. What was she before? I was the wife of a peasant farmer. And where did she live? Like her parents over there in Safiabad. Is she happier here than she was in her village? No, not happy at all. What was better before? But there we could farm and we owned something. But now, what can you do with 40 cents a day? How many times in the week do you eat meat? Never. Only boiled rice. We haven't the money. Just enough to buy rice, oil and a little sugar. Milk? We don't have any at all. We had to sell to you. What do they do about milk for the children? The cow has nothing to eat either. How can it be expected to give milk? We've nothing to feed it on and not even the right to graze her. How much land did he have? 25 acres. How much did he get for it? $485. And what did he do with this money? Half of it went to pay for the new house, and the rest went to pay for food. He owned 22 acres. And what is his job now? He's without a job. But how does he live? His son works and he lives on that. In any revolution, some sections of the population are doomed to disappear. In this case, it is the peasants, the craftsmen, the small traders, and the tribesmen. The White Revolution, planned and organized at the top, has benefited the former ruling class, which has taken over control of the economy. One might as well be on Wall Street or at the London Stock Exchange. And in fact, it's in the West that these Iranian businessmen, like the Shah himself, invest the bulk of the profits from their business in Iran. With personal profit as the avowed objective of the White Revolution, all other forms of activity are doomed to disappear. By destroying an outmoded economy, the Iranian leaders have also destroyed a society. This revolution has been carried out not only despite the people, but against their interests. The peasants, driven from their lands, have not become factory workers. Since the state has provided them with no technical training, not only has it to purchase its factories fully equipped, but also fully staffed, or invest elsewhere. This is the harsh reality underlying the much publicized investments in foreign companies. In the Royal Carpet Factory at Esfahan, the women and girls work 10 hours a day for a wage of $1. Is this progress? A new social class has been created, made up for the most part of middlemen, officials, policemen and soldiers. Is this progress? some of the more far-sighted Persians ask themselves where all this is leading, this society motivated by profit, to which all must submit, whether it be those whom it employs or those whom it destroys. What purpose does it serve if it doesn't serve society? And whose purpose does it serve?